Albert Einstein. That's a name that I think everybody would recognize. Albert Einstein, one of the most brilliant physicists ever. And he said this. He was also a very wise man in many ways. He said, either everything is a miracle or nothing is a miracle. That bears repeating. Either everything is a miracle or nothing is a miracle. Now, the compact Oxford English Dictionary, one of the ways it defines miracle is this way: an extraordinary and welcome event believed to be the work of God. An extraordinary and welcome event believed to be the work of God. Now, in light of that statement and that definition, we can say, sure, all creation is a living miracle, isn't it? All of creation is a series of miracles. All creation is full of miracles. Life itself is a miracle. Life itself is sustained through an unending series of miracles. And you might have guessed already what I'm going to talk about: miracles. So if you want a title, that's about as short a title as I can give you: miracles. Take the creation. You know, it feels like we're sitting still. I'm standing. I'm not totally still. I'm moving a little. But you're sitting still, aren't you? But as we all know, we're not really. Because this earth, this good terra firma that we are living on, is moving at about 1,000 miles per hour at the equator. 1,000 miles per hour. That's just about the right amount of spin. Why not 1,200 miles per hour? Or why not 500 miles per hour? Why 1,000? Well, that's just about the right amount of spin, because if the earth spins too slow, each part gets exposed to the sun too long and it gets too hot. And the buffer for life is pretty narrow. And so if it gets too hot, no life would be here. But then again, if it spins too fast, each part of the earth is not, the bulk of the earth is not exposed to the sun enough, and it gets too cold. No, it's just the right amount of spin for the amount of exposure to heat that's needed and the proper loss of heat when it's out of the sun. But also, as a side note, the earth is traveling through an expanding universe. Even the planet itself is not sitting still, in the sense that the universe is expanding. Okay, 1,000 miles per hour. And just the right spin in order to have the right temperatures for humans to be here and other life. Okay, well, then you got gravity. And you got centrifugal force, because things that spin generate centrifugal force. Have you ever gotten on a merry-go-round and you're the only person going to be on the merry-go-round, and 3 or 4 other kids are going to stay on the ground and they're going to run around and try to spin it, run and spin it, hanging on to it, but faster and faster, and let you hang on? Well, you feel the pull. Now, when I went to Fairview University, as we kiddingly referred to it back in Mississippi, first grade through 9th grade, Fairview Elementary and Middle, we had a contraption out there on the playground that we call the strides, S-T-R-I-D-E-S, the strides. It's probably more like a maypole type thing, but you had this one pole, and you had a ring up at the top, a good-sized ring, and hanging down off of that ring all the way around were these chains with a handle. And so you could get a hold of the handle, a bunch of kids could, and you could start walking around that. And what they like to do is you'd have one kid, the others would get a hold of the pole and the handles, and they'd start walking around faster and faster. And the one kid that would hold the handle, it would lift him off of the pad and lift him out. And the challenge was to see if you could move around fast enough that the kid that was brave enough to give it a try would hang on to the handles, and you would really stretch him out as close to parallel to the ground as you could. The centrifugal force pulled you away. Well, there was one kid, and kids can be mean sometimes, we know that. They got him stretched out almost parallel to the ground, and he started screaming for them to let him down, because his grip, he wasn't the strongest kid around, and you can't hang on. And, of course, they're laughing and carrying on. It's a bunch of fun, and all of a sudden, his grip broke loose, and he was about parallel to the ground, head towards the pole, feet out that way, and, boy, he went flying, and it wasn't nice, soft, grassy ground. It was gravel. I don't know how many times he skipped on that gravel, but they never could get him back on the strides again. So, this centrifugal force thing, he didn't get seriously hurt, but he did lose some skin. You think about gravity. Holds us to the planet, doesn't it? Where would we be without gravity? And I'm not sure anybody, we know it works, we know the reality of gravity, but I'm not sure anybody can fully explain what gravity is. Now, every Friday night, which also helps my wife's sanity, to have a video chat with our son down under, he and his wife, Lauren and Sally. And I have kidded him that as we're on this video chat, and as Angela says, it's so much better than just having a phone to the ear and talking with somebody, but to be able to see them, to interact with, being able to see each other and all of that. But as I've kidded him, Lauren, if you're standing up and I'm standing up, we are feet to feet. Your head and our heads are pointed in opposite directions. Why don't you fall off? I'm up, you're down. Now, just making jokes about it, but you think about it. Gravity, just the ability to be stuck and to be held. You got all these laws. Light and photosynthesis. Life on our planet is based on photosynthesis, light and photosynthesis. And if you ever noticed, plants, they will grow or lean toward the light. It's interesting. I grew up in the shadow of the bomb, the Cold War. And we never knew, society didn't, when life might end on this earth. Now, we can read the scriptures. We're very familiar with them. I'm not going to turn to Matthew 24, verses 21 and 22. But it talks about a time coming when, except those days should be cut short, which will be cut short by Christ's return, that no life would be saved on this planet. We know that all-out nuclear warfare will totally destroy this planet. And it's not just the engaging of the war itself only. It's what it produces. And the term that was used during the Cold War that many of us are very familiar with was nuclear winter. That the skies would be so filled with the debris and the dust and the smoke and everything that the all-out nuclear war generated, that light could not penetrate. And our way of life on this planet is based on light, on photosynthesis. And of course, we will come back in time to that same kind of scenario as far as pending nuclear war and all the fallout from it. And Christ will step in time to stop it being carried out. But you take light also. All colors are in it. What is a prism? a prism, or a rainbow. It's just simply taking the light and the different wavelengths and breaking it down to the wavelengths or the colors. The hottest color is blue, and it's diffused in the sky. That's why the sky is blue. That hottest color is diffused in the sky. The next hottest, green. What's the most common color on the earth? It's green. Green vegetation. Trees, grass, all of it. Take water. Now, when I get cold, I shrink. In the wintertime, my ring and my watch get looser on me. Now you say, yeah, that's because a lot of the blood at the surface is going deeper into the body. You don't have as much blood in the surface, which is true. I said I shrink. But in the summertime, the watch is tight, the ring is tight, there's more blood in the surface. It's interesting about cold, and you think about this, heat expands things, cold contracts things. That is the natural way it works with heat and cold, that heat causes expansion, cold causes contraction, with one exception: water. Water. Why? I mean, we know that when water freezes, it expands. But why? Well, you've got ponds, you got lakes, you got rivers. There's life there. There's fish and all. Can you imagine if a river started freezing over, as rivers will freeze over? And by the way, I have seen pictures of the Tennessee River at Huntsville, Alabama, back decades ago, where it got so cold that the Tennessee River froze over enough that cars drove out on it. So it can get really cold in the South and parts of the South at times. But anyway, you take a river, it freezes over. Let's say the ice, the water doesn't expand. It does the natural thing of contracting, and that sinks, and above it freezes, and it keeps. Pretty soon you've got a river of solid ice, and everything in it, most stuff in it, obviously would die. Same with a lake or a pond. But it freezes, it expands, it grabs the shoreline, and it forms a covering. It forms a cover. And then even what's under it, relatively speaking, stays warmer. But you see design in this. You see, it's kind of like a bumblebee. Bumblebees can't fly. Did you know that? But don't tell that to the bumblebee, because they don't know any better. Aerodynamically, they don't meet the laws of physics with their body size and wing size to be able to fly. But they don't know any better, so, they don't read the internet, they don't read the scientific journals, they don't know those laws, so, they just go on about flying and doing what bumblebees do. It's just interesting how that we see these things and how they work. Okay, go back to the earth. Go back to the spin. Go back to the orbit of the earth around the sun and all of that. The earth on its axis has a 23.5 degree tilt. That basically has to do with giving us our seasons. Okay, let's just, since we live in the northern hemisphere, let's just focus on the northern hemisphere, the seasons in the northern hemisphere, and let's focus on the two opposite seasons, summer and winter. In the summertime, and let's take Chattanooga, part of the northern hemisphere, where it's like, boy, it's hot. We're having a hot summer. The earth in its orbit around the sun, the earth, and I'm in reference, again, referencing this to the northern hemisphere, all the whole earth, northern and southern, obviously this is true of it, that the earth is furthest away from the sun in the summer. You say, well, then why is it hotter? The 23.5 degree tilt. The earth in the orbit around the sun is the furthest away in the summertime, but the northern hemisphere is pointed toward the sun. That gives summer. Now, if it was in its orbit at the closest to the sun, and it pointed at it, it would be a whole lot hotter and maybe too hot. In the winter time, like what we're in right now, in the depth of the winter, there's a point where this Earth is the closest to the sun in its orbit. But the northern hemisphere is pointed away from the sun. You know, you look at all of this, and take the immensity of the universe, the immensity of it. Take the Milky Way galaxy that we're in. Unless they've done some adjustments on the size of it, and we know the Milky Way galaxy is just one tiny little speck, so to speak, in a universe that can't even be measured. But the Milky Way galaxy is 10,000, it's like an oval, kind of, but it's 10,000 light years across the narrow way, and it's 100,000 light years the long way. And what is a light year? Well, a light year is the same length of time as a year in our lives. It's a year. That's all a light year is. It's a year. It's a full year. But a light year is how far light can travel in 1 year. From the time I had my birthday in December till I have my next birthday this coming December, that year, a light year is how far light will have traveled in 1 year. And since light travels at 186,000 miles per second, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi, light traveling at the speed of 186,000 miles per second, then you begin to grasp the vastness of the distance of 10,000 light years if you were just talking about the narrow side of the Milky Way. And let me present something. If you could be right in the center of the Milky Way galaxy, 50,000 light years that way, 50,000 light years that way, 5,000 light years that way, 5,000 this way, and you could get on a spaceship that could travel at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. If you could get on a spaceship where you could travel at the speed of light, and you're going to cross 5,000 light years just to get outside the galaxy, you would only have to live to be 5,000 years old. This is why I laugh at people who say, maybe we're going to get to where we can explore space. We might explore some of it with telescopes. Mortal man, listen carefully to what I say, mortal man was never intended to explore this universe. Mortal man. Only immortal man, when we're resurrected, like the angels, will even have the power to explore the universe, which we will then. But no. And if you go out to the closest star, which is Alpha Centauri, unless they've discovered one closer since that I'm not aware of, but Alpha Centauri, the closest star, if you could go out there and point a telescope back towards planet Earth, Earth would just be a speck. God's handiworks are present all around us. You can't get away from miracles. Romans 1, in verse 20. Romans 1, in verse 20. For the invisible things of Him, from the creation of the world, not just from that time, so to speak, but also involving the creation, from looking at the creation and what's there. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. You know, the acknowledging that there is a God. There is a master designer. There's an all-powerful being who has created all of this and sustains all of this, so that they're without excuse. As one person likes to say in tagging on to any emails he sends, he puts this statement on his emails when he sends them to me and different ones. I don't know where he got it, but here's how it goes. To say there is no God is the epitome of stupidity. Look up into the heavens at the vastness of the universe, and you see the hand of God. Look around at the precise detail of everything that is, and you see the hand of God. Look within at how awesome you are made, and you see the hand of God. Look down into the microscopic world at the building blocks of the universe, and you see the hand of God. We are without excuse if we say there is no God. He likes to tag that on. I'm glad he does. Now, it's kind of like the cartoon somebody sent me one time. It's titled Atheist Logic. It shows this first frame. This atheist is throwing his hands up and smiling real big, and he's looking at this tremendous building that has been built. And he says, this building is a marvel of architectural design. Then the next frame shows him in a museum looking at paintings, and he's bent over looking at this painting. It looks like Mona Lisa, but he's standing there and he says, this painting shows a master of technique. And then the next frame shows him with a hood raised and looking at the engine, and he says, this engine is a real piece of sophisticated engineering. Then it shows him, the final frame shows him outside with birds and clouds and geese flying over and a waterfall and all the beauty of creation, and he says, clearly, no one made any of this. You can't get away from miracles. It's like a little boy was sitting on a park bench with one hand resting on an open Bible. And he was loudly exclaiming the praise of God. Hallelujah, hallelujah, God is great, he yelled, without worrying whether anyone heard him or not. Shortly after, along came a man who had recently completed some studies at a local university. Feeling himself very enlightened in the ways of truth and very eager to show this enlightenment, he asked the boy about the source of his joy. Hey, asked the boy with a bright smile, don't you have any idea what God is able to do? Why, I just read that God opened up the waves of the Red Sea and led the whole nation of Israel right through the middle. The enlightened man laughed lightly, sat down next to the boy, and began to try to open his eyes to the realities of the miracles of the Bible. That can all be very easily explained. Well, modern scholarship has shown that the Red Sea in that area was only 10 inches deep at the time. It was no problem for the Israelites to wade across. Well, the boy was stumped. His eyes wandered from the man back to the Bible laying open in his lap. The man, content that he had enlightened a poor, naive young person to the finer points of scientific insight, well, he got up and he turned to go. Scarcely had he taken 2 steps before the boy began to rejoice and praise God louder than ever. The man turned back to ask the reason for this resumed jubilation. Wow, exclaimed the boy happily, God is greater than I thought. Not only did he lead the whole nation of Israel through the Red Sea, he topped it off by drowning the whole Egyptian army in 10 inches of water. And you probably have heard this one. One day, a group of scientists got together and decided that man had come a long way and no longer needed God. So they picked one scientist to go and tell God that they were done with him. Well, the scientist walked up to God and he said, God, we've decided we no longer need you. We're to the point that we can clone people and do many miraculous things, so why don't you just go and get lost? Well, God listened very patiently to the man, and after the scientist was done talking, God said, very well, how about this? Let's say we have a man-making contest, and the scientist replied, okay, great. But God added, now we're going to do this just like I did back in the old days with Adam. The scientist said, sure, no problem. And he bent down and grabbed a handful of dirt. God looked at him and says, no, you go get your own dirt. Either everything is a miracle or nothing is a miracle. Life itself is a miracle. Acts 17. The Acropolis, Mars Hill, Acts 17, where the philosophers were, and Paul shows up. And they've got the altar to the unknown God. And they're not called, and they don't understand, and all of that. But he springboards off of that to tell them some realities and some truth. And in Acts 17 and verse 28, do we really read this with our minds as well as our eyes? Do we really grasp what he is saying? For in him, in God, we live and move and have our being. We live. We couldn't live without photosynthesis. We couldn't live without food supplies. We couldn't live without gravity. We couldn't move without gravity. We couldn't stay on the planet. Everything would come apart. The envelope of air around this earth would not be held to it. You just dissipate into space. And if you look at it from enough distance, you realize how thin this envelope of oxygen-contained air is around this earth. And you don't have to go very high off of the surface before you've got to be on oxygen if you're going to be up at certain levels. In him we live, and we move, and we have our being. We have our existence. And then I back up to verse 25. It says, neither is worship with men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing he gives to all life. Life is a miracle, and it's sustained, maintained by a series of miracles. He gives to all life and breath. And it's through those miracles of life, called or uncalled, we have existence. He gives to all life and breath in all things. You know, it's interesting, and I'm not going back to the book of Daniel, but there in Daniel 5 and verse 23, the statement is made, back there in Daniel 5:23, and the God in whose hand your breath is. The king was told, the God in whose hand your breath is. Now, we're familiar with scriptures like Colossians 1:16, by him, talking about Christ. It's about Christ there in Colossians 1, verse 16. We're told about how by him were all things created. Very familiar for us scriptural knowledge. And in verse 17, in the King James, it talks about, and he is before all things, and by him all things consist or exist. And it's interesting, in writing to the Hebrews in Hebrews 1:3, and again, I'm not turning to these, you're very familiar with them, just want to refresh them. Hebrews 1:3, it talks about how that God, through Christ, the Word, before he ever became Christ, before he ever became flesh and blood, He's always pre-existed, we know that. But upholding all things by the Word. Upholding all things. Upholding all things? Upholding life, upholding gravity, upholding what's necessary and needed. Part of the things that he upholds. But upholding all things by the word of his power. And then in the faith chapter, Hebrews 11, verse 3, it says this in Hebrews 11, verse 3, it says, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. They were made of things that are not visible. God creates from his energy, from his power, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. They're made from something. They're made from his power, his energy. He's a creator. Again, the miracle of life itself. Life itself, all the way from conception through the whole process to birth. If you go with me to Psalm 139, Psalm 139, verses 13 through 16. Psalm 139, verses 13 through 16. David wrote, for you have possessed my reins. You have covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows right well. My substance was not hid from you when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth, or actually from the 16 elements of the earth. Your eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect, or that is, not completed. And in your book all my members were written. What are his members? His arms, his legs, his fingers, his eyes, all of that. What book? Which in continuance, by the fact that the book continued to be followed, in continuance they're fashioned, they're formed, when as yet there was none of them. At the instant of conception, the tiniest cell in the human body, the male cell of life, and the ovum, when they come together at conception, there are no fingers to see, there are no eyes, there are no arms, there's nothing except two living cells coming together, that at that point, at that instant, and there's some scientific studies that show that at the instant of conception, there is a tiny little spark. But a brand new being at that instant is blueprinted. And at that point, it is determined whether they'll be male or female. It is determined whether they, what skin color. It's determined whether they'll be straight-haired, curly-haired, kinky-haired, whether they'll be blue-eyed, brown-eyed. The basic height, the basic size, some of those things obviously can be modified. But at that instant, the blueprint of that person, all things being given equal, at that instant, it is determined what that baby will be 9 months later after full growth and ready and coming to the birth. Now, at conception, you can't read the blueprint. I can't either. We technologically, we can't read it, in the mother's womb at that time. But it's amazing what they can do even with in vitro fertilization as far as reading certain things with the fertilized eggs. But here's what's interesting. God created all this. God can look at the instant of conception, and he can know exactly what that baby is going to be 9 months later. That's why if he so chooses to resurrect all of the aborted babies in the last great day, if he so chooses, which I think he will, but that's my personal thought on it, he can bring them up, resurrect them as full-term 9-month babies that they would have been if they hadn't been aborted. Or when conception is going to take place, God can cause the genes and the chromosomes to come together the way he wants to produce a being that will serve him like Jeremiah. Interesting. Miracle, absolute miracle. I might probe that a little bit further someday, but in Job 33, and verse 4, Job says, actually it's one of his friends speaking here, the Spirit of God, Job 33, verse 4, the Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty has given me life. Again, things that are made, not made from things that appear, not made from things that are visible, but are made from something that's invisible, from power, from energy. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty has given me life. And it's interesting, here in chapter 34, verses 14 and 15, chapter 34, verses 14 and 15, if he set his heart upon man, if he gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh shall perish together, and man shall turn again unto dust. We're totally dependent. Miracles. Miracles. Interventions beyond the natural laws, or in spite of the natural laws, this is the classic idea of miracles. When people say, oh, that's a miracle. The classic idea is an intervention beyond the natural laws or in spite of the natural laws. But the natural laws themselves are miracles. Underpinned or sustained, those natural laws. Underpinned or sustained, maintained by God's power and His Spirit. Miracles, in the classic sense of how people think of miracles, involve any supernatural intervention by God, and obviously they're the most obvious, aren't they? Such as the Red Sea parting. I mean, that was obviously what we would call a classic miracle. You walk on dry ground that God has dried with walls of water on either side of you, both sides of you, towering way up above you there, and you're walking on this seabed with towering walls of water being held up until you get through and the Egyptian army comes in after you, and then those walls are released. Those are classic. Or Joshua's, sun, stand still. And the sun stood still. Now, we know that it's not the sun that is moving. But way of speaking, sun stand still, God literally had to stop the earth from spinning at that point, to intercede and miraculously to keep the sun in the same position while the enemy was being fought, so they couldn't count on darkness to let them escape. Stopping the sun, not the sun, stopping the earth, stopping the spin, so the sun and the moon, and even stopping the moon in its orbit. If you remember the accounts, you find the account in Joshua 10. I'm not going to turn back there, but Joshua 10, verses 12 through 14. It's interesting. Okay, it is interesting, and I will read 2 Kings 20, verses 9 and 10. 2 Kings 20, because this is the account of Hezekiah, told he's going to die. I covered that recently. And he was given a choice. Of course, you put the two accounts together in Isaiah and here, and you get a little bit more added to the account. But in 2 Kings 20, verses 9 and 10, actually verse 8, Hezekiah said to Isaiah, what shall be the sign that the Lord will heal me, and that I shall go up into the house of the Lord the third day? And Isaiah said, verse 9, Isaiah said, "This sign shall you have of the Lord, that the Lord will do the thing that he has spoken." Here's your sign. And it's going to be left up to you, Hezekiah. Which do you want as the sign? Shall the shadow go forward 10 degrees? Or in other words, the sun will continue to move from our perspective. The earth will just keep as it's doing, and, in the sundial there, it's just going to continue the shadow's going to continue to move 10 degrees. Or shall it go 10 backwards from where it was and just be reset 10 degrees backward? Now, notice his reply, verse 10. And Hezekiah answered, "It is a light thing for the shadow to go down 10 degrees. Why? It's because that's what he's used to. We think nothing about the earth spinning, the sun moving around, moving through the sky from our perspective, and it sets. Well, why do we take it for granted? It takes God's power to make that all work. It's the power that could stop the earth from spinning, that could freeze the sun in the sky, or make it from our vantage point look like the sun has been moved back 10 degrees. Why does that take more miraculous power from God than God making everything work to begin with? It's more obvious to us because we get used to the natural things and we just think of them as natural, yet if it weren't for God, they wouldn't work. No, but let the shadow return backward 10 degrees. These may seem long ago, those particular examples, and far away, but there are many obviously closer at hand too, aren't there? And what's interesting is the power that was behind that, the power that was behind those miracles, that power is still there. Psalm 33, verse 5, and I want to touch upon this. Psalm 33 and verse 5. It says he loves righteousness and judgment. Now here's what I want to focus on. The earth is full of the goodness, and the word goodness there in the Hebrew can be rendered mercy. The earth is full of the mercy of the Lord. There is no knowing until a future time how many acts of mercy God has done, is doing, or yet shall do on this planet. And again, we think of miracles as interventions by God. And of course, that's entailed in the subject miracles because they are miracles. And they are there. But I just want to share, I look back over my lifetime in the church, and I've seen some pretty classic miracles. I just want to share a few. So take miracles of healing. I knew a man years ago who was a Korean war vet. I knew this man. I talked to this man. He was a Korean war vet. He came out of the war a paraplegic. His spinal cord was severed. God called him into the truth. He read up, studied on healing. He wanted to be anointed. He was anointed. Within 3 days, he was walking. He was out of the wheelchair and walking. He went down to the office to have his disability, as a vet, his disability check stopped. The people behind the desk, the counter, they almost couldn't believe what they were seeing. And they said, "We can't stop your check." He said, "I don't need it anymore. I'm not disabled." They said, "But your medical records, everything, you "You're disabled." He said, "Look, I'm standing here, I'm walking." They said, "It'd take an act of Congress to get your check stopped." Now, the man's probably dead. I doubt if he's still alive, but I guess to the rest of his days, he got a disability check that he didn't need. I remember a man years ago in the Memphis congregation. He broke his leg. And infection got into the bone and completely ate out the bone for a 6-inch stretch. His lower leg. He had 6 inches where there was no bone. The bone ends were 6 inches apart. They were going to amputate his leg. Some friends got him, family, friends, got him out of the hospital. He was anointed. Later, he went back to a doctor and they x-rayed the leg. And between those two bone ends, there was bone the size of about a pencil lead, all the way from one end to the other. So thin, and as time went on, it thickened more and more and just welded in between, bridged between those two. My nephew, as just a little toddler, little fella, broke his arm at the feast one year. The break was verified. He was anointed before, I won't go through every detail, just to simply say he was anointed. And the doctor that was going to have to set the arm, and my nephew was screaming in pain, and he was covered in red rash from the pain. And the doctor said, I cannot set the arm until I take an x-ray to make sure of what I need to do, how to go about it, whether, I guess, surgery or just a cast. But anyway, my nephew got, all of a sudden, just before the x-ray was shot, he went totally quiet. When the doctor came back out with the x-ray, he was just shaking his head. There was no break anywhere. He was healed just like that. And, of course, I grew up with my mama, as we called her, my mother's mother, mentally ill for 26 years. And that's the only way I knew her. And then when I was just a young fellow, just previous to becoming a teenager, just about the time, getting close to my teenage time, my papa, as we called him, he pulled into the driveway, and we saw he had somebody with him. He'd gone down to the asylum down near Jackson, because he would go down there to see my grandmother. And he had somebody in the car with him. So we ran over to see who it was, and we got close and saw that it was Mama. She rolled the window down and talked with me and talked with us just like I'm talking now. Just like that, God healed her. And she lived to be 97 years old. Miracles of provision. The miracle of Israel in the wilderness for 40 years, when you talk about miracles of provision, they had to be minimum. Just the men and women, the 600,000 men and the 600,000 women, 1.2 million, not counting the kids. There had to be at least 2 to 3 million people. And you move them into a wilderness area? Do you know how much food it takes? Okay, we got manna. Well, that's a miracle. Do you know how much grass it takes for the livestock? You know how much water it takes for everybody? We talk about having fires and cooking and doing. You know how much wood it takes? Can you imagine? No, it was miraculous, and they lived in a miraculous situation for 40 years. The sobering thing was, folks kept dying because everybody 20 and above was going to die off in that 40 years, and it would only be the 19 and youngers at the beginning that would still be alive 40 years later to go into the land of promise. but food and clothing and livestock and wood and water. And it plainly says, and if you just want a reference, Deuteronomy 8, verses 3 and 4, Deuteronomy 8, verses 3 and 4, where Moses told them, your clothing didn't wear out. 40 years. Again, as I've said, the only thing that won't wear out in 40 years is polyester, and they didn't have that. That was a miracle in itself. And how about miracles of protection? I remember in one of the congregations I pastored years ago, we had a member, and he was known for really driving fast. This is down in South Alabama, the Geneva congregation, actually. And when he would leave services, before he even, there was a stretch where, kind of a long stretch at the edge of town, and then it opened up into the countryside. And before he got off of that stretch at the edge of town, he's probably going to be doing 80. Well, this particular Sabbath, for some unexplained reason, he got sick. No reason to get sick, but he got sick. And he felt too bad to drive his car. And one of the other members said, look, I'll drive your car, and so can follow me and, and all, but I'll drive you home. On that stretch where that sick member would have been flooring it and really burning the road up, it's like a 35-mile zone because it wasn't out of town, but it was just open road right there. The one that was driving for him was only doing about 35. He was following the speed limit, and the tie rod fell off. Anybody that knows anything about steering knows if your tie rod falls off, the end of it, you have no control over the steering. For it to fall off, if you got a choice between your tie rod falling off at 35 miles an hour or 80 miles an hour, pick 35. Years later in Amarillo, Texas, God protected that man. He protected him. He saw to it that he could not drive, and the tie rod would turn loose when it was at a safe speed with somebody else driving. Probably saved the man's life, or at least maybe major injury. Years later in Amarillo, Texas, in the 200 one-way, 400 round trip, Liberal, Kansas, Amarillo, Texas circuit, an elder went up for me on one Sabbath to speak in Liberal, and then come back to Amarillo. And up on the high plains with those distances, you have to travel faster. You can't, you have 9:30 services in Kansas, and you have 3:30 services in Amarillo, and you got to spread as much as you can because you have to, and you can't, as we say, lollygag. You've got to move along. He went all the way up there at a fairly high rate of speed, of necessity, went all the way up to Liberal, came all the way back to Amarillo. When he pulled that late afternoon or evening, when he pulled into his driveway at his house, his tie rod turned loose. You can't tell me that an angel of God didn't have his hand around that tie rod end all the way up there and back. Some of you might remember the classic case years and years ago where in one of the factories up north where there was molten copper, and the church member, as the big ladle was swinging across the area, it tipped at the wrong time, malfunctioned, and a member was standing in the middle of the floor, and it tilted right over where he was standing, and all that molten metal cascaded like a shower right down over him. And when they checked with that man over there later, and they checked with that person and that person, they checked with the personnel that was standing all around that could see from every angle, every one of them lost sight of him. And when it all hit the floor, he walked out unscathed. God umbrellaed him. We have a blind man down in Atlanta, Brent Reynolds. And he was about to cross the street. He was in the Tallahassee congregation. And I got there that day, and Brent was a little bit disheveled. and his seeing eye dog, Inky, and he told me what happened. He stepped out to cross the street, and I think he had the right of way, but whatever and however, somebody wasn't paying attention, and they hit him, ran up on him. Brent told me, he said, I was under the car. Hit him and hit the dog. I was under the car. I could feel the undercarriage. I'm under the car. He had to crawl out. Now, there's not a whole lot of room under a car. But if you get hit and one runs up on you, what are the odds that you're not going to be hurt pretty bad? He was okay. He might have got a little bit sore later. He came on to services. He was okay. Years ago, we had a pet, had a dog, little Heinz 57, and began to snap at the kids. And I eventually wound up having to have it put down. I wasn't going to give it to somebody else and have it bite their kids, and didn't have a choice. I had to have it put down. But the final straw was when he snapped Lauren, and Lauren was maybe 5, 6, I don't remember the exact age, but he snapped Lauren, and I brought Lauren in to, clean where he got him in the face. Not a bad bite, but there was a fang mark on his cheek. He cut the cheek just enough to bring some blood. There was a fang mark there. Well, when Lauren closed his eye, there was a fang mark on the eyelid, bloody. One little bit of a fraction of an inch in further, and his eyeball would have been punctured or torn out. We as parents know what this does to us. And protection. Let me tell you what happened last Sabbath. I was in Gadsden. We'll roam in the morning and Gadsden in the afternoon. And I'm a hall closer. I usually stay around to be one of the last ones to leave. Well, I left, and of course it's totally dark and all of that. Within 1 mile of the hall on that back country road, and it's totally dark, and there's this black cat that runs out off the shoulder right into my lane. Now, he did a little bit like a squirrel. He couldn't figure out which tire he wanted to run under. And I tried to miss him. Boom, boom. I didn't miss him. I tried. But on a little narrow 2-lane road, you don't have much dodging room, and I wasn't going to wreck. Here's what I thought. There are some people that say it's bad luck if a black cat crosses your path. I don't believe in superstitions. But at the same time, I know that there's a spirit world that wants us to believe in certain superstitions and will set the stage or play it up. Anyway, dead black cat, sorry. I did what I could to miss it. I go into Gadsden, because I have to go through Gadsden on the way home to Georgia. And I got to the other side of Gadsden. I am, just outside of town. It's dark. There's traffic. I'm on a 4-lane. And my mind registered, and I instinctively acted before I consciously thought it through, because all of a sudden, there's a man right in front of me in my lane, on foot. It happened so fast, I couldn't see his face. I just saw him from the chest down. And he had come out of the darkness. I don't know if he was running, walking, standing. It happened so fast. And I just instinctively yanked to the left and immediately yanked back because I didn't want to lose control of the car. Threw it to the left and back just like that. And I just went around him. That's how close I came to having a man on my bumper, on my hood, and through the windshield. I would have been totally in the right. There was not a thing I was doing. I was driving the speed limit. There was not a thing I was doing that put me in the wrong. What that man, I don't know if he was high on something or something was chasing him, and it would have been totally his fault. but I don't want it on me that burned into my image is a man crippled for life or dead coming through my windshield. I'd have to live with that the rest of my life, and it would bother me. It wouldn't matter that I'm totally in the clear. It would bother me. God spared me. Coming up here today, hadn't even gotten fully out of Rome, Martha Berry College area, north side of town there. And somebody turned right in front of me on a 4-lane there, and I had to ride my brakes to keep from broadsiding them. I live on alert when I'm on the highways, because the most dangerous place in America, if you go by the numbers, are the highways. And I've only driven about 2 million miles in my lifetime. Protection. Protection. I'll wrap this up. Hebrews 13 and verse 6. Hebrews 13. I'm thankful for miracles of provision, miracles of protection, miracles of healing. In Hebrews 13 and verse 6, so that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. He truly is. And I will not fear what man shall do unto me. And when it says, so that we may boldly say, is referencing back to verse 5. Let your conversation, your conduct be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have, for he has said, and this is the bottom line, I will never leave you nor forsake you. What happened last Saturday night, what happened this morning, that shall also happen again at some point. When I get in my car to leave after a while, I will be on high alert and watching, because God is my protector, but he also says, Rick, oh boy, don't go dilly-dallying at the wheel. How many times has God intervened for us, both known and unknown? Miracles help build faith. We live in the midst of miracles, but the greatest miracle of all, because the subject is miracles. And I would be remiss if I didn't tack this on to the end, because it's really the biggest miracle of all. The miracle of the converted mind. The miracle of the converted mind. The opening of the mind. That is, to become like God in our thinking and our doing. That's the greatest and most important miracle of all. It's the miracle of growth. The miracle of change. The miracle of overcoming. The miracle of victory. That is the greatest miracle that God is working in our lives. Life is full of miracles. They're all around us. Life itself is a miracle, composed of a series of miracles. And I would admonish us, learn to recognize and appreciate such fact, because we're richer for it. But never forget that the greatest miracle of all that God is granting us is the working of conversion in our mind and our being through the power of his Holy Spirit.